So this is called tawassul. Tawassul is where you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for assistance by relying on something that you've done. So tawassul mashru' is where you ask Allah, Ya Allah, there was a chance for me to commit zina this one time, I didn't do it, forgive me or make this easy for me because of that. Ya Allah, there was nobody else around to help this old lady, it was sincerely for your sake, at least I intended it to be that way. So accept whatever deed I'm doing now and forgive me because of that. That's acceptable. Let's call it tawassul mashru'. Where you begin to rely on someone else's love, like Allah's love for the Prophet ﷺ or the Prophet ﷺ's love for Allah, that's where it becomes, again, a slippery slope. And the consensus or the cautious consensus to avoid that. To avoid that, right? Because if you begin to rely on someone else's action, then where's the limit, right? What are you exactly asking for? It's a slippery slope because someone can say, oh, look, I don't have to do anything because Allah's love for the Prophet ﷺ is much greater than I'll ever be able to match. So I already have that. Or the Prophet ﷺ's love for the Ummah is greater than my own capacity to do any good. And this is the slippery slope of shirk, guys. Yani, this is how it happens slowly, right? You have, if you look at the story of how shirk came to be done in the peninsula, you have people who were very loyal, committed to service, and used to serve as icons of khair. When they died, the communities began to miss them. And they said, okay, let's build statues to remind us of them. So at the beginning, the statues were there to remind people of what it means to actually be close to Allah. And then they were actually situated outside the city. And slowly, they were brought inside the city generation by generation. And then people after a while started to say, I can never do enough on my own compared to this statue who's been there as a reminder of good for 500, 600 years. So they began to appeal to Allah using the statue's name at the beginning. And then generation after, it was now a state where they're looking at the statue and saying the statue is much closer to Allah than it will ever be. So, Ya Allah, forgive us through them. And then it turned into, oh statue, forgive us because we're too impure to ask Allah directly, so ask on our behalf. So when we say cautious consensus, it's the consensus that has put up guards to prevent from that happening or falling into things of that nature. Tamam? No. Yeah, it's a big discussion. It's a big discussion. Then you have the other side who will say, look, but the Prophet ﷺ said, I don't ever fear that my ummah will commit shirk again, because it's so clear and so obvious. But that's a hadith where you have questions of the authenticity of the hadith, and then you have the Prophet ﷺ saying in another narration, I don't fear for my ummah the major shirk, but I do fear the minor shirks. There are many forms of minor shirk that the ummah will fall into. But may Allah protect us from that. Yeah. So, Ya Allah, out of my love for this individual, if this person is known to be close to Allah, yeah, what's the issue? Love is an action. Love is an action. But like we said last time, the dua has to be, it's a weapon. It has to be coupled with everything else. So if you have, for example, Imam Shafi'i used to actually make this dua. He used to say, Ya Allah, out of my love for Imam Malik, forgive me for this and Ya Allah, out of my love for Imam Malik, grant me more knowledge, grant me more knowledge. So he did that. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal used to do something very similar. So this, it's like because it's so real, it's so tangible. You love somebody so much, right? You can say something like, Ya Allah, out of the love that I have for my children, right? Grant me the ability to truly be sincere, to be committed. But the problem is when that becomes your only dua and your only reliance, and everything else has become secondary. You're not praying, you're doing your adhkar, you're not doing your istighfar, you're not doing your nawafil, and you're doing that and you're relying on that. That becomes the problem. Does that make sense? Umar al-Khattab, if somebody has a problem with the later generation, Umar ibn Khattab used to make dua, and the narration is authentic. Ya Allah, out of my love for Al-Abbas and the family of the Prophet ﷺ, forgive the family of Umar. So they used to, but it has to be put in context that this is an expression That's part of the larger du'as that we make, and has to be in context of you doing your salawat, you're doing your salah, you're doing your basics and your nawafil. And this becomes extra on top of that. Does that make sense, guys? Perfect. Absolutely. Whether the money is halal or haram, that will have an impact on the barakah in your family and your family's family. There are hadith where it says, actually, and we're going to come to this, Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned this hadith, that a decision which is sinful can trickle down into not just one generation, but multiple generations, if they're directly affected by that. But the problem is that unlike the concept of original sin in Christianity, from an Islamic point of view, you're not condemned by it. You can overcome it through dua, through istighfar, and it will not impact you if you did not know or you're not fully aware of it. But once you know and you're fully aware of it, then it will impact the family in that sense. Does that make sense? So let me give you an example. Your husband is bringing haram money into the house. Will it impact your relationship with Allah? No. But it will impact your relationship with your husband. There's less barakah, more fighting, more this, more that. The minute you know about it, then it can impact your relationship with Allah. It can impact other things going on in your life. Other questions? We had a few more, I think, that came last time. We can take them up quickly. Yes? Yeah, you can say multiple paths. Yeah. That's correct. Yeah. Correct. And you choose those routes, and you're constantly choosing. And every choice creates new possibilities and removes other possibilities. Okay? So it is constantly evolving. Yes. From your perspective.
Multiple choices to reach the same destination.
No.
Okay. Because there's that famous story.
No.
Yeah. Guy told his horse or something, and the saddle of the horse. And then after he came back from the bus, he said, "Oh, I'm going to give him 2 dirhams anyway." And the guy ended up selling the saddle for 2 dirhams or something like that.
Yeah. That story is true. But it's about halal and haram. Do you guys know the story? Can you share the story?
This is the story.
That's a good way to start the story. This is the story. The one and only story. Tafadhal.
This is how I remember it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ali Radran, he was going to go pray in the masjid one time. And before going to the masjid, he asked some stranger to basically look after his horse. So the guy says, "Okay, sure." Ali Radran goes and pays him off. He comes back. The horse is still there, but the saddle of the horse is missing. So Ali Radran goes to the market to go and get a new saddle. He goes to the market, he sees his own saddle which is there. And he asked the guy where he got it from. He said, "A man came and sold it to me for 2 dirhams." And then Ali Radran remarked and said, "I was going to give him 2 dirhams after coming out of the market."
Yeah. It's a nice story. It shows you that, like, one of the things that are written for us is the rizq, how much money we make. But we decide whether that is going to be halal, haram, whether it's going to be attained lawfully or unlawfully. So here, the 3 dinars that were written for him were meant to reach him. Had he waited, he would have been able to receive them through a charity. But he decided to steal, so he received it through sin.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I ask, like, multiple choices.
Yeah. So we're talking about, look, multiple choices to reach the same destination, in that every decision that you make is from a list of choices that are available to you. And every decision creates and eliminates other possibilities. But they don't always lead to the same path. Meaning, oh, it's just meant to be. Whether you go here or here, it's gonna, no, it's meant to be. No. Because that's a form of saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preset everything. And it's not. You do have choice. لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ أَنْ يَسْتَقِيمُ. Does that make sense? Yes.
Getting one of this, that may deny you from this message, so it's simple. You're denied something. But that doesn't mean that the provisions were not written for you, because like if you have a full of this, then you were able to attain in life, but you only choose the path that can get you the lower boundary of that. That doesn't mean that it's not correct.
100%. We discussed that last time. Did you guys hear that point as well? The clarification? No? Can you explain it one more time?
It is as if you have a pool, like a certain amount that of total this that Allah will you that you can attain in life. You choose the right path. If you choose the wrong path and you get a lower amount of this means that you have to move on with the variable. So it's still written, but you only chose a certain amount of it.
Attained a certain amount of it. Yeah. So let's look at it this way, because I think we're just to kind of close this conversation on qadar. When you're born, the minute you're born, a few things are written for you, right? Your age, lifespan is written for you. Your wealth is written for you. And the amount of happiness and sorrow is written for you, right? Now, every time, this is your lifeline. Imagine every choice that you make. Let's say this age, it's written for you that you could attain, let's say between 90 to 95 years old, right? Your wealth throughout your life, let's say $1 billion. That's very possible, very doable, inshallah, right? Huh? $1 million? لا مسكين حبيبي. لا إن شاء الله خير. You guys are capable, inshallah. Right? And let's say happiness to sorrow ratio, you can say like 70 to 30. You're going to have, a third of your life roughly, and then 2/3 of your life, right? Or even a little bit more, right? You got 70% of your life that's blessed, and 30%, well, happiness could be a curse as well, right? But let's look at it this way. You decide one day to, and by the way, this is what's written at the age of birth. Every year more things are written because of the du'as that you make. Let's say at the age of 21, you decide to make du'a Laylat al-Qadr. So then also, in addition to that, you have your spousal rizq is written for you. The person that you're going to marry, that's not written at birth. But you could, through the du'a, kind of, set yourself up for that. Spousal rizq, your job, other forms of rizq, health, right? Every decision that you make either brings you to actualizing this rizq or takes it away. So today, I decide to watch, you're on YouTube. You're watching either halal content or you're watching useless content. Useless in the sense that it's neutral. It's not really going to benefit nor harm. And you watch, haram content. The halal content increases your khushu'. Your khushu' goes up. The halal content increases your focus. Increases your barakah. Right? And therefore, bringing this rizq closer to you. Or setting you up to achieve it faster or in a more blessed way. This can, because you've decided to waste some time, can actually neutralize or push this further. This can cancel it altogether. Push it far, far, far away or cancel it altogether. Like render it inaccessible. So it's written for you. It was written on Laylatul Qadr. But this pushed it further or rendered it inaccessible. Inachievable. Completely. Until you do tawbah, make dua again, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again, and then you could have a chance, add it again, or it's khalas, you have something else that's going to be rewritten for you. And this is all changing every day that you make a decision, every decision that you make. Yes.
Those are well, that's in the sense that there's not going to be a possibility that Allah did not write for you, cannot achieve outside of what Allah has.
Of course, there's no way to, because it's, yeah, it's all within the code per se. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So because one study, you already know what you're going to say, but like it's not written down.
Okay. So I gave this example kind of to make it accessible. Imagine you're watching a soccer game right now, or you're watching a soccer game, and then you record the soccer game, and then you give people the copy of the soccer game after the soccer game took place. So you're watching a copy of what happened. Because you're living in this time, space, limitation, you can only access that after the game took place. Allah is not limited in the same way that you are. So you can access that copy of the game before the game took place. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's al-Alim, al-Qadir capacity gives him access to all of these choices before you're even able to actualize them as they're happening. And because he's the most capable and he's the one who has the absolute will, al-Qadir, from Qadr, right? Al-Qadir, the will is his, right? Al-Mashi'atu lak, Ya Allah. So he has rendered all of these possibilities through his will as well. Does that make sense? So if Allah did not give us life, there would be no age to begin with. If Allah did not create this world, there would be no wealth to begin with. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create whatever it is in your brain that is firing right now to achieve happiness or to perceive it, it would not be possible to begin with. That's where the qudra of Allah manifests, because He created the precursors that allow all of this to be possible, and the choices. He gives the choices, right? The choice at life. You can't create life. You can't bestow the soul upon a person. You can't do that. You can create a biological body, but you cannot create life. Allah creates life. So all the possibilities are because of Him. All of the will is because of Him. And then every decision that we make is bringing us closer to what was pre-written and close to what is constantly written for us through the dua that we make. Tamam? So, and this is by the hadith, like Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, لا يزيد في العمر إلا البر. Nothing increases your lifespan besides or better than bir. Bir is doing good, like being righteous. So leaving a good life or living a good life or leading a good life can actually increase your lifespan. And that's why you see a lot of the like people who live very long tend to be the people of the Quran who really dedicated that time to teaching the Quran. Imam Malik lived until his 80s, right? Others, like my teacher, when he was teaching me, subhanAllah, the Quran, he was 91. So I started with him when he was 91. And by the time, I finished with him, he was already in his late 90s, like 97, 98. And so it was his teacher and teachers. They lived for quite a long time. So leading a good life can increase this, both in quality and quantity. So in barakah and in quantity. Does that make sense? And then the second part of the hadith in a second, وَلَا يَرُدُّ الْقَضَاء إِلَّا الدُّعَاء. Nothing changes the qada more than the dua. It can be rewritten. And then the third part of the hadith, وَإِنَّ الْمَرْءَ لَيُحْرَمُ مِنْ رِزْقٍ بِالذَّنْبِ يُصِيبُهُ. This is the third part. وَإِنَّ الْمَرْءَ, and the human being, لَيُحْرَمُ, will be prevented, مِنْ رِزْقٍ, from a rizq that is written for him or her, بِالذَّنْبِ, through the sin, يُصِيبُهُ. يُصِيبُهُ meaning what? The dhanb becomes like a, an arrow that strikes. The sin becomes an arrow that strikes at the qadar. You're written to be with this husband of yours or this wife, but you fall into zina, and this zina becomes like an arrow that pops that from being, actualizable or realizable. Right? As an example, because there's a lot of examples of that in the seerah or in the tradition. So that's where it comes from. The hadith, the backdrop to this. Does that make sense?
Are we adding to the pool, or are we simply opening up more of a pool to us?
We don't know. That's part of the ghaib.
We don't necessarily know.
We don't know. We don't know. We don't know that. Like this, there are different schools that will give different answers. But
Time is supplied Allah anyway.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, you're already a step ahead. Good. But at the end of the day, we don't know because it's part of the qadar. Like when we say this age is written for you, is it a pool? Like, is it from 60 to 90 is a possibility? And you can live between that possibility based on the choices that you make? Or is it an X? And this X is constantly subtracted from and constantly added to, depending on day-to-day choices. These are the two hypotheses from within the tradition. I lean more towards this, like it's possibly an X, and it's constantly being adjusted based on what you do, right? Think about your genotype versus your phenotype, right? Your genome is predetermined, but phenotypically, you can alter a lot of that based on what? Based on diet, choices, health, things that you consume, things that you do, lifestyle choices. So similar to that, right? Okay, I think we've spent quite some time on this, but I hope it's important, and I hope that because this is something that a lot of us struggle with as Muslims, because we may not be fully articulating all the time. There's one more thing. We talked about this last time. The agents or the choices that we have, the choices themselves don't have a will of their own. They're still part of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know how for example, we said last time, if X, then Y happens. So if you spend your money to go for Umrah, if you use your money to go for Umrah, there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying that your risk is going to increase. Your money is actually going to increase. If we define money as risk, this could also be health, right? Wealth. It could be company, happiness. So we know this from the hadith. It's authentic. If you go for Umrah, because you're using your money, using your time to go to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to bring life to the house of Allah, a promise is that your risk is going to increase. Something is going to change in your life positively. Could be your wealth, could be your health, could be one of these things. Now, here's the thing. The X itself does not have any power on its own. It's not causative in the sense that, and you walked in right now. We were just talking about what we discussed last time, right? The X is not on its own going to lead to Y. Because this is conditional on what? On Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepting it. So there's no cause that is intrinsic on its own, especially in spiritual causes. Right? So when I go into the ground and I dig up and I plant the seed is not going to ask me, or the ground is not going to ask me, are you Muslim? Are you not Muslim? You pour the water, things happen, cause and effect. But still, that cause in itself or on its own does not have any intrinsic power. It's only through the will of Allah that that cause is taking place. And Allah can suspend that cause at any moment and make it ineffective at any moment. And this is where the explanations from many stories in our tradition can be very valuable. So, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused time to pause for certain people, like Ashab al-Kahf, who slept for 309 years but were not affected. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala paused the cause and the impact on them. It's only through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that cause can take place. So there's no such thing as like life just happens, things just happen. Everything is, it's kind of this program and things just are. They're on their own and there's no intervention or there's no agency or presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's agency and choice is present in every choice. And Allah can render it null and void, or Allah can render it accelerated and acceptable. So go back to the Umrah example. It doesn't mean that if I go to Umrah, I'm going to come back and get my rizq. Because what's the condition here? It's got to be accepted by Allah. It's got to be sincere. No one can read that but Allah. So you can have the whole world saying, MashaAllah, you know, Hadi, you went for Umrah, it was so nice, you were so kind, you lifted your mom on your back for the whole tawaf, bro, you've reached. No, but you haven't, because it was insincere. And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can access that. طيب? So these ahadith become very important, and hopefully this kind of clarifies. Yes, akhi. Rizq in the sense is both dunya and ukhrawi. Things in dunya and also in akhirah. But for the most part, when we talk about asbab, we talk about material asbab, things that we can access. But the asbab or the rizq in the akhirah is, of course, rizq as well. Right? To be with your spouse in Jannah is a form of rizq. So, for example, let's say let's give you this example. Right? You did all the right choices. You got your wife or your husband. You're with your wife, your husband. MashaAllah, tabarakallah, great life. And all of a sudden, you decide to betray your husband or betray your wife multiple times. Now, you get away with it in the dunya because nobody knew. But you get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're about to enter Jannah and you realize that your spouse is no longer with you in Jannah because you were disloyal to them in this dunya. So do you see how the rizq, which is both the dunya with rizq and ukhra with rizq, you got only a share in the dunya and the akhirah. Does that make sense? Good. Does that answer? Does that help? Does that clarify? More questions? Right, let's do this. I think we can do this one-on-one later, inshallah, and then let's continue so that way we can. Okay. So let's do this. We're gonna actually summarize a few things, inshallah. وقال معروف رجاؤك لرحمة من لا تطيعه من الخذلان والحمق. And then a few other ahadith here that I mentioned. This is on page 51. We're going to just start with that, inshallah, very quickly. So Ibn al-Qayyim goes and he talks about this. He talks about, as we said, he talks about a bird with two wings. The wing of hope and the wing of fear. And Ibn al-Qayyim says you can't lean to either. You can't in the khutbahs always be talking about hell, 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 or Jannah, 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 Jannah. You have to talk about both. Al-khawf wa raja, fear and hope. You have to fear Allah, you have to fear hell, you have to fear the punishment, fear the distance, and you have to have hope. So hope, al-raja, wa al-khawf, fear. Now, of course, certain people, you know, will respond to certain contexts. You know, after 9/11, there was a lot of people who didn't want to use the word fear, fear, fear. There's a lot of phobias in the community already. It's heightened. There's a lot of fear, fear, fear. So you have a lot of, you know, scholars who started to say things like, instead of saying fear, let's say awe. Right? I am in awe of Allah, and because of the awe, right? I don't want to disobey Him. They said, you know what? Instead of saying awe, let's use other words like reverence. I revere Allah, right? I revere Allah. And instead of hope, you know, we can say things like love, right? Love, 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 love. And the context where the conversation shifted from talking about fear, like this was almost gone. There's a lot of focus, intentional, unintentional, on Allah's love, 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 love. And in the North American context specifically, because the Christian context is God is love, God is love, God is love, God is love, a lot of Muslims responded to that pressure by talking about love, 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 love. But what happens when you focus on love without fear is it actually renders your iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your personality as a Muslim. It can actually become off balance. And you see it in many people. Where they begin to say, oh, it's just a minor sin, bro, it's okay. Don't judge me, don't judge others, just take it easy, chill. That kind of attitude. And then the Qayyim goes and he talks about like the attitude of the earlier companions is very different. They would say to Al-Hasan, why are you standing the night in prayer? Crying, crying, crying. قيل الحسن نراك طويل البكاء فقال أخاف أن يطرحني في النار ولا يبالي. I fear that Allah would throw me into Jahannam and it wouldn't make any difference. Like, who am I to even ask Allah for anything? Who am I to expect anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I'm nothing. I'm meaningless. So this was the way that the earlier companions used to think. You know, Abu Bakr used to say, you know, even if I live my entire life in closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I can never safeguard or guarantee my salvation on my own. Allah guarantees it categorically to the people of taqwa and the people of iman. But I can't guarantee that I'm from the people of iman. Even Umar al-Khattab himself used to go to Kitab al-Wahi, the writer of the Wahi, and used to go to the secret keeper of the Prophet ﷺ, and Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman. Before the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he told Hudayfa, here are the list of hypocrites. Don't expose them, but keep a close eye on them so that you can, you know, safeguard the affairs of the community in Medina. If they're behind something, then know that it might not be the best, right? Because they're hypocritical. And they become this perpetuated over time. And Umar used to constantly ask, am I one of those people? Am I a hypocrite? Am I a hypocrite? So, and Ibn al-Qayyim, he goes on and he says that you don't want to focus so much on love, 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 love. And he says, I'd rather a friend who says it to me how it is than someone who sells me false security, a false sense of security. So I'd rather someone who's going to be constantly pushing me to be better, pushing me to be critical, than someone who's going to basically sell me a false sense of security. Now that's an attitude. And remember, in context, what happens is, I call this the dialectic, the societal dialectic, guys. In any community that you're living, people are affected by the dialectic. The dialectic, we start with point X, and then we react and go all the way to point Y. And then we shift back to point P, back to point Q, back to point R, back to point T, and then we finally meet somewhere in the middle where that balance is supposed to be. Right? I'll give you an example of this so that it makes like a practical sense. A lot of the early Orientalists who went to Muslim societies, they actually blamed Muslim societies for being too liberal. Muslim societies were too liberal. Why were we too liberal, guys? What were the two main reasons why Muslim societies were painted as liberal by the Orientalists? Who can tell me? Why were our societies too liberal? Like, 1870, early 1900s. Okay, explain. Good. And also, that's the first point. The main thing that they looked at, like polygyny, like you guys are, wait, what is this polygyny? Like a guy can marry multiple women, and then women have these, specific things that they can do in the court, like initiate a khul', they can, basically initiate their own divorce, and all of these things that were considered to be too liberal. Property, as you mentioned. And the other thing was actually the codification of the law. Like the Sharia itself was not codified. What do we mean by codified? Codification is like you go to the judges and the law was not written down in the sense that if you do X, then Y happens. If you do P, then Y happens. The law was very customizable to the situation. Let me give you an example. You know the hadith of the woman who came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, Ya Rasulullah, I committed zina, but I'm pregnant. The Prophet ﷺ said, go deliver the baby. She came back, Ya Rasulullah, I gave birth, go raise the baby. Ya Rasulullah, the baby is now, I'm done suckling, continue raising the baby. So the Prophet ﷺ, even though the law of zina is, as we know, right? Had the zina, the penal system says that zina, right? Zina is going to be punished by, lashing 100 times if you're single, and rajm, to death if you're married. But the companions, in their day-to-day exercise of this, they would actually exercise, best practices or best interests for the person. So if there were no 4 witnesses, there was not this, then the judge himself, herself, could decide to basically say, no, you know what, you're not going to be punished under the Sharia because we feel that you didn't have enough knowledge, there were some things not in place correctly. So the Sharia was much, much more encompassing and much more subjective. Subjective is it was a case by case. You present your case in front of the judge, and the judge would basically rule for you, and that ruling would be only to you. And that's why fatwa is a personal opinion for that specific person, not for anybody else. But what happened when the colonization took place, they had wanted this, didn't make sense. They were writing rules down and they had to basically write the law. So they asked Muslim societies, you need to get your act straight. You need to make rules in a way where it's like easy for the judge to read. If X happens, then Y. If P happens, then Q. There's no more subjectivity in the law. And that's where codification of the Sharia took place. Codification means you had something which was very fluid, very living, very alive, and now you're structuring it. And by structuring it, you make it what? You make it rigid. You make it rigid. So the same people now that are saying, oh my God, Islamic law is so harsh. Islamic law is so hard. You guys are such difficult people. Like, just like, 100 years ago, we were being called liberal because we had all these rights in place and the Sharia was too flexible. It didn't make sense from a judicial point of view. It had to be structured, and that led to codification. And this process itself was very colonial in nature. So even the way that we understand Islamic law itself in these courts, in these education systems, in these universities, was the result of a codification process. So when we talk about the dialectic, you go from being called a liberal, flexible society, and now we are the most rigid, the most harsh, the most this, the most that. But this was like maybe 20 years ago. Now Muslim societies are going the other way. They're being affected by the harshness again. And think about Saudi Arabia. Oh, you guys are, no rights, no this, no that. So we go from no rights to women in terms of being able to drive, now to a point of like pacifying or trying to basically give the complete opposite image by saying, no, actually, we're going to open everything up. So if we're going to have Nicki Minaj come and we're going to have, everybody's going to come, mashallah. It's khalas, open buffet. Right? That's the dialectic. And the balance is somewhere in between. Yes. Good. What's your name? Ahmed. When the colonial experience happened in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in the entire Muslim world, almost in India, specifically India, because India was a big hub, by the way, for Islamic law. The Indian subcontinent, incredible legacy of ilm, hadith, and it was amazing, especially law. Law was incredibly rich in the Indian subcontinent because of the diversity. But when they came in, it's exactly what happened. They said that the British colony would basically have the role of the Supreme Court. They would rule on everything else. And then they reduced Islamic law to areas of family. So family law, right? Marriage, divorce, janaza, the rituals, salah, right? So you rule on those areas. But citizenship, taxation, things that became associated with the modern states, all of that was basically stripped of Islamic law in the sense that there was no more subjectivity or flexibility and had to be codified into now state law. So every state had to basically take that and write it down in the form of like modern day law. In the typical setting, what you had in the typical setting, if you go back to the pre-modern states, pre-modern state meaning pre-modern Egypt. If you go to like the Uthmani, Khilafah in Egypt or in Saudi, like modern day Saudi, the peninsula, the Hijaz, what you have is you have the mufti of the city. And then under the mufti, you have the Shura Council. You have the judicial system. And you have the ulama. Under the ulama, you had the four madhahib. Each had their own school. And then recognized under all of this was also the tribal structure. So let's say you and I had an issue. You and I had a problem. Business, marriage, whatever it may be. We could resort to any of these for arbitration. So we go to our local tribal leader, and our local tribal leader would rule between us. حلت. ما تحلتش, okay, it didn't get resolved. It would then escalate to the ulama. And sometimes there will be these networks formed. What do you guys say about this? Or the ulama say, okay, what madhab do you follow? Oh, we're Hanafis. Oh, you know what? You told her you're divorced 3 times in one sitting. It's done. It counts as final divorce. But if you're Shafi'i, it's different. If you're Malik, it's different. Here's the evidence. Okay, now you're stuck between, you're a hardcore Hanafi, khalas, it's done, answered. But you're maybe not madhab affiliated, or you had some questions, you needed to basically, go higher. It would go to the Shura Council. And if you need to go higher, then it would go to the judge. The judge would listen, take all evidences, and rule. The superior court, or the Supreme Court, is now, or was then occupied by the position of the Mufti. And the Mufti was in the same circle, as the Amir / the Khalifa. Like that level of, that's the same circle. Not the same powers, but the same circle. Same relevance in the community. This entire system was completely abolished by the state-induced judiciary with the Supreme Court, the local family court, and other forms of court. Does that make sense? So people back then had much more freedom and much more flexibility. And no opinion was what is it called? No opinion was absolutely binding until it got to this position. Like you could go all the way up to that position. I know this is not, again, yeah, this is not specifically tazkiyah, but this is important as conceptualization history that we need to know in terms of yani, how we got to where we are. This point is about the dialectic, right? The dialectic, where you have the same perception or idea fluctuating between 2 points until you find a balance in between.
Would basically have that accessible to them. So you're saying they make judgment off of best interest of the community and that person.
Yeah.
The information was there.
يعني that's debatable, because you had manuals on fiqh, you had rules, but the rules, guys, look, if you pick up a book on jihad, you can never make jihad because there's so many ifs and buts and conditions. So Islamic law is so dense and it's so flexible in terms of like the possibilities that it requires a lot of understanding and wisdom and customization. The Qadi has that knowledge, and the scholars have that knowledge, and the leaders of the community have that knowledge, and that's why there's a lot of trust. But you needed to, as a colonial, you need to supplant that. You can't have that much flexibility and that much power being distributed. The state's job is to monopolize all that power and to maintain the right to violence only for itself. Nobody else has the right to implement violence or use violence or power except itself. So those two things become very important for the modern state. But so let me give you an example. Before Salah ad-Din could do what he did, Nur ad-Din as the leader, he did something very important. He told Ibn Asakir, look, we have a very important objective here, and that is to get rid of the Crusaders from the Holy Land, from Palestine. So he told Ibn Asakir, I need your help. I need you to write a small document, and he called it the 40 Hadith on encouraging jihad. And he made it very accessible, very simple, because the mission was very simple: to eliminate foreign presence. And it was very successful. And Ibn Asakir becomes the iconic figure that led the intellectual conversation. So what happens, you have a lot of flexibility in the law, but it is the leaders who are able then to say, this is the context. We're living in a colonial context. This is what needs to be the focus at this time. So that law is very specific, but there needs to be a lot of wisdom and subjectivity in the way that it's interpreted. And it has to serve the best interests of the person that you're dealing with. The state, when it implements itself, when it finds itself, when it's, when it's building itself, it doesn't have the best interests of each and every individual. It has the best interests of what? Itself, sustaining itself, monopolizing that power. And that's where codification went wrong. Because when you codify, but keep all the possibilities, that's fine. But when you codify and make it the only possibility, then it becomes problematic. Does that make sense? Khair. We'll take one more question. Okay, fine. We'll take two more questions. No problem. Ahmed and the sister. Yeah. American lawmakers, they were inspired directly by the Islamic experience, whether they want to admit it or not, right? We know, for example, many of the American figures had mushafs, Qur'ans in their libraries and read and had access to Islamic law books and read those Islamic law books. So there's no doubt there's a lot of mimicking. But at the end of the day, when you watch very closely, the modern state is much, much more repressive in its approach and much, much more power focused and centric in its approach than the pre-modern community leading structures. That's a given. And it's agreed upon. ما في خلاف في الموضوع. طيب. Now in terms of like the Second Amendment, which is the right for or what you were saying, the right for the community to struggle in arms against an unjust ruler. Of course, even in the Muslim community, it's the same. But there's ta'ah, there's leadership, trust, once that ta'ah is earned and respected. So let me give you an example. There's an ayah in the Quran, Ya Ahmed, where Allah says, وَإِذَا جَاءَهُمْ أَمْرٌ مِنَ الْأَمْنِ أَوْ الْخَوْفِ أَذَاعُوا بِهِ وَلَوْ رَدُّوهُ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ وَالْأَمْرِ مِنْهُمْ لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُ. Now this is talking about in the context of, imagine we're living in a city and someone comes yelling, oh, we're being attacked, everybody run for your lives. If everybody starts running for their lives, paranoia, phobia, fears, it causes absolute chaos. The Quranic model is no. Once you have an announcement that is made like that, nobody's able to announce it. It becomes illegal for you to announce it. Has to go and has to be announced to who? To the people in charge. And then they make a decision based on best interest of the community and make sure that you limit the phobia and whatnot. Now, this is when you have people like Umar and the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr, then you resort to them. Everything becomes, through them. People that have earned the respect of the community, local people of trust. But when you have colonially instated positions and backed positions and people that are, very far away from the desire of the community, very far away from the community's interests, that you saying now, oh, there's ta'ah for Wali al-Amr, absolute respect for the Wali al-Amr, becomes very problematic. Does that make sense? Again, contextually specific. Okay? You had a question, we'll finish with that, inshallah. Faddali. No, Ibn Asakir's teachers and Imam al-Suyuti's teachers, there were lots of female judges. In Mauritania, by the way, a lot of the teachers are females. A lot of the judges are females. And in many family courts, it would not be unusual for you to be standing in front of a female judge.
Is this unusual in the sense that we favor male judges or female judges, or is it simply about who is qualified?
It's about qualification. And also the society's capacity to sustain it socially and otherwise. If we're not investing in sisters and giving the same equal education opportunities, then you don't expect more female judges to be existing in that community. So it's not, you have to have the sustaining structure socially, which Mauritania as a community has in ways that Yemen, for example, would not. Does that make sense? Good. طيب. Any other questions? Alas? Again, we took a bit of a tangent, but I hope this was beneficial. Can you, just by a show of hands, how many of you guys benefited from this conversation? Okay, alhamdulillah, good. All right, good. Jazakumullah khair. We'll see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.